Hey there! Welcome to today's deep dive. You're interested in abandoned housing, right?
Mhm.
Specifically in Baltimore and Philly. We've got your stack of articles right here, and let me tell you, you've been doing your homework. I'm really struck by this one article that talks about Baltimore's struggle to even define abandoned. They've got estimates ranging from 12,000 to over 40,000 properties.
Yeah.
That's a huge margin of error.
Yeah.
And you flag some interesting potential solutions, too. What's jumping out to you as the most crucial thing for our listener to understand about this issue?
Well, I think what grabs me immediately is the sheer scale of this problem. It's
Hmm.
massive.
Right.
And yet the solutions often seem piecemeal.
Mm.
We're talking in an entire neighborhood sometimes. It's not just about fixing up buildings. It's about understanding why they became abandoned in the first place.
Mm.
Like this one article mentioned a $70 million investment in Baltimore by some big
Oh.
organizations. 70 million.
Hmm.
Sounds impressive, right?
Yeah.
But then it goes on to say there's basically no proof it actually worked.
Oh, wow. So it's like throwing money at a problem without even knowing if you're hitting the target.
Exactly. And that's the danger here. We need to be smarter, not just bigger in how we address this.
Mm.
Which brings me to something else you highlighted, the importance of data.
Okay, let's unpack that. Because several of these articles talk about data as being key, but in different ways. Some focus on using data to identify properties before they become a problem,
Right.
while others talk about using it to track the effectiveness of different interventions.
Right. It's about being strategic. Think about it. Cities already collect tons of data. Property taxes, code violations, even things like crime rates and school performance. If you put all that together, you can start to see patterns predict which neighborhoods are most at risk.
So it's like having a crystal ball, but for abandoned buildings? That's kind of amazing.
It is. And some cities are already doing this. One of your articles mentioned how Philadelphia uses data to pinpoint which properties are most likely to attract crime or lead to further decline in a neighborhood.
Hmm.
They can then target those properties for intervention, whether it's demolition or rehab.
And that kind of targeted approach is probably way more effective and cost effective than just reacting to problems as they pop up, right?
Absolutely. It's about being proactive rather than reactive.
Yeah.
And it's not just about tearing buildings down either.
Right, because demolition is just the first step, and these articles talk about that. One of them even used this phrase, snaggletooth appearance, to describe what's often left behind. Not exactly inspiring, right?
Right.
So, what happens after the demolition? What should cities be aiming for?
Well, I think the key word here is revitalization. It's not enough to just clear away the blight. You have to create something desirable in its place.
Yeah.
And that requires a vision.
A vision for what? Give me some
Well,
specifics.
for starters, think about the residents. What do they need? What would make their neighborhoods more livable? It's about creating safe, attractive spaces with things like parks, playgrounds, maybe even community gardens.
And good schools. Don't forget about those. Because if you're trying to attract families back to these neighborhoods, the quality of the schools is a huge factor.
100%. And it's not just about the residents who are already there either. It's about attracting new people too.
Which is where things get tricky, right? Because you've got to find a way to revitalize these neighborhoods without pushing out the people who already live there.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance between attracting new investment and preventing displacement.
So how do you do that? Because it seems like a real tightrope walk. You want to make the neighborhood nicer, but you don't want to price out the people who've called it home for years.
It's definitely a challenge, but there are things cities can do. One idea that came up in your research is mixed income housing.
Mixed income housing. So like the idea is to have a mix of, affordable and market rate units in the same building or development.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That way you're bringing in people with different income levels, which can create a more, diverse and resilient community.
Okay, I see how that could help. But it also sounds like one of those things that's easier said than done.
It definitely takes careful planning and execution. You need the right mix of units, the right location, and the right kind of community engagement to make it work.
Speaking of community engagement, one of these articles talked about how important it is to get residents involved in the revitalization process from the very beginning.
Absolutely. Residents are the ones who know their neighborhoods best. They know
Right.
what's needed, what's working, and what's
Huh.
not.
Plus, if you involve residents in the planning, they're more likely to feel ownership over the outcome, right? It's like,
Right.
hey, we helped make this happen.
Exactly. And that sense of ownership can be a powerful motivator. It can lead to residents taking better care of their properties, participating in community events, and even starting their own businesses.
It's about creating a virtuous cycle of positive change, which ties back to that idea of revitalization being about more than just bricks and mortar.
Precisely. It's about creating a sense of place, a sense of community. And that's something that can't be built overnight or imposed from the outside.
One thing I found interesting in these articles was the idea of using data not just to identify problems, but also to track the success of different revitalization efforts. Because, like we talked about earlier, you can throw a lot of money at a problem without really knowing if it's working.
Right. Data can help us move beyond anecdotal evidence and gut feelings to a more rigorous, evidence-based approach.
So instead of just saying, this program seems to be working, you can actually point to the numbers and say, look, crime rates have gone down, or property values are up, or whatever metrics you're using to measure success.
Exactly. And that kind of data-driven approach can be really powerful, both for justifying investments and for making adjustments along the way.
It's about being accountable both to the residents and to the taxpayers who are fitting the bill for these initiatives.
Absolutely. And it's about learning from what works and what doesn't. Because the reality is there's no one-size-fits-all solution to this problem.
Which is why it's so important to have that strong foundation of data and research, right? To understand the local context, the specific challenges, and the potential opportunity.
You got it. What works in Baltimore might not work in Philadelphia and vice versa. Every city has its own unique set of circumstances.
Speaking of Philadelphia, one of these articles mentioned that they've committed to demolishing 14,000 abandoned structures. That's a huge number. Do you think that kind of large-scale demolition can be effective?
It can be, but it's not a silver bullet.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember what we talked about earlier. Demolition is just the first step.
Right. You can't just tear everything down and expect things to magically get better. You need a plan for what comes next.
Exactly. And that plan needs to involve the community, it needs to be data-driven, and it needs to be focused on creating a better future for everyone.
I think this is a good point to start talking about some of the social and economic forces at play here, because abandoned housing isn't just a physical problem, right? It's a symptom of deeper issues.
100%.
Yeah.
You've got things like poverty, unemployment, crime, lack of access to education and healthcare. All of these things contribute to the cycle of decline that can lead to abandoned housing.
And then in turn, abandoned housing exacerbates those same problems, right? Like if you live in a neighborhood with a bunch of boarded up houses, it can make it harder to attract businesses, improve schools, or even just feel safe walking down the street.
Absolutely. It becomes a self-perpetuating cycle, which is why it's so important to address those underlying social and economic issues if we want to make a real dent in the problem of abandoned housing.
So where do you even begin to tackle something as complex and multifaceted as this?
Well, one thing that came up in your research is the idea of using abandoned properties as an opportunity for community development.
Okay, tell me more about that. What kind of community development are we talking about?
That could be anything from urban gardens and community centers to affordable housing and business incubators. The idea is to take these vacant spaces and turn them into something that benefits the community.
I love that idea. It's about turning a blight into an asset. Instead of seeing these abandoned properties as a liability, you're seeing them as an opportunity for positive change.
Exactly.
Right.
And that kind of shift in perspective can be really powerful.
So how do you actually make that happen? How do you go from a vacant lot to a thriving community garden, for example?
It takes a combination of things.
Hmm.
You need funding, of course, but you also need community buy-in, a solid plan, and the right partners.
Partners, like what? Who are the key players in this kind of community-driven revitalization?
Well, it could be anyone from local residents and community organizations to city government and private developers.
So it's about bringing all these different stakeholders together and getting them all pulling in the same direction.
Exactly. Because no one entity can solve this problem alone. It's going to take a collaborative effort.
This reminds me of something we talked about earlier, the importance of having a vision. If you're going to revitalize a neighborhood, you need to have a clear idea of what you want that neighborhood to look like and what kind of community you want to create.
I completely agree. And that vision needs to be shared by everyone involved, from the residents to the developers.
Because if you don't have that shared vision, you're just going to end up with a bunch of disconnected projects that don't add up to anything meaningful.
Exactly. It's about creating a cohesive whole, something that's greater than the sum of its parts.
One thing that struck me in these articles was the idea that revitalization isn't just about improving the physical environment, it's also about investing in people.
Absolutely.
Huh.
It's about providing residents with the resources they need to succeed, whether that's job training, access to health care, or affordable childcare.
Because if you're not investing in people, you're not really addressing the root causes of abandoned housing, are you? You're just putting a Band-Aid on a much deeper wound. It's like that old saying, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day, teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. Except in this case, it's more like, give a neighborhood a community garden and they have fresh vegetables for a season. Empower residents with job skills and economic opportunities, and you create lasting change.
That's a fantastic analogy.
Yeah.
And it highlights the importance of taking a holistic approach. It's not just about fixing up buildings, it's about investing in people, strengthening communities, and creating a more just and equitable society.
And it seems like there's a growing awareness of that, right? These articles talked about how more and more cities are starting to see abandoned housing as not just a problem to be solved, but an opportunity to be seized.
That's right. And there's a lot of exciting innovation happening in this space. Cities are experimenting with new approaches, partnering with community organizations, and really trying to think outside the box.
Like what? Give me some examples of the kind of out of the box thinking that's going on.
Well, one thing I came across in your research was the idea of using vacant lots for urban farming. Not just
Mm-mm.
community gardens, but actual for-profit businesses that are creating jobs and providing fresh food in neighborhoods that often lack access to healthy options.
That's incredible. And it ties into so many of the things we've been talking about, creating jobs, improving health outcomes, revitalizing neighborhoods all in one fell swoop. Are there other examples like that?
Absolutely. Another interesting trend is the rise of community land trusts. This is where a nonprofit organization acquires lands, sometimes vacant lots,
Wow.
sometimes even abandoned buildings, and then leases it back to residents at affordable rates.
So it's a way to create permanently affordable housing and prevent displacement in neighborhoods that are undergoing gentrification.
Exactly. It's a way to ensure that the benefits of revitalization are shared by everyone, not just newcomers with deep pockets.
I love that. It's like a community-owned safety net against the forces of displacement.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it's just one example of the kind of creative solutions that are emerging when people start thinking differently about abandoned housing.
It's about turning a problem into a possibility. Instead of seeing these vacant lots and boarded up buildings as symbols of decline, you start to see them as blank canvases for a better future.
Beautifully said. And that's what makes this such a fascinating and hopeful topic despite the challenges involved.
I completely agree. So, listener, as you continue to explore this issue and dive deeper into the specific challenges and opportunities in your own community, here's a final thought to chew on. What if instead of viewing abandoned properties as burdens, we saw them as indicators, as signposts pointing us toward the neighborhoods and communities that need our attention and investment the most? Food for thought. And until next time, keep diving deep.